name is Simon Cade, and this is DSLR Guide. Today's episode is the review of my Canon 600D. So this is just kind of my opinion that I've built up after having this camera for about 9 months. First up is image quality. Now, it records at 1920 by 1080, which is kind of your standard HD recording. And one thing I will say is there are many cameras out there that say that they shoot 1080, and they may do, but there's good 1080 and there's bad 1080, and it's kind of, there's no real way of quantifying it, but DSLRs generally are known for having pretty good image quality in general. So, you know, some camcorder that has a really small sensor that you can find at Argos for 300 quid, it's generally going to look quite home video like. Just the way that the image is processed on a DSLR, it turns out very well, and yeah, compared to everything else in the price range, it pretty much knocks everything out of the water. Now, I'm speaking generally for kind of DSLRs here, but this camera being a crop sensor camera, the image is pretty good. Now, the only other thing I can compare it to is the 5D Mark II, which is kind of considered the next step up, and that camera is going to have more clarity and generally a better image. So although it doesn't record with any more pixels, just it'll be more clear and a generally cleaner image. So being a £350 camera, it does far better than anything else that isn't a DSLR, up to like £500 or so. So in that respect, it's really good. And then compared to the 5D, which is £2,000 or something, it also keeps up pretty well. You know, the 5D is better, but not by much. So in relation to the price, I would say resolution is pretty darn good. So in terms of dynamic range, it's the same story. It's far better than a lot of the video cameras that are out there for the same price range, and even many of the ones that are above it. So having the APS-C sized sensor is pretty good for dynamic range. But of course, compared to the 5D, it's pretty close again. The 5D does have a better dynamic range, it does record more detail in the shadows, but when you're looking at the price, you know, it's again pretty close. So next up is the sensor. Now the T3i has a crop sensor, an APS-C sized sensor, which is 1.6 times smaller than the 5D. Now, when the 5D came out, it was a huge game changer because it had a far larger sensor than all of the other video cameras in the market. Now generally that's still the case for now. If you look in the Argos catalogue of video cameras, generally you'll see a lot of camcorders that have really small sensors, and the T3i kind of has the same idea as the 5D. So it's a slightly smaller sensor, but again it's still far superior to all of the kind of standard video cameras and handy cams. So with this being a crop sensor camera, you do have to times the focal length of your lenses by 1.6. Now generally I don't think this is much of a problem. It's something else to remember, I suppose, and it does mean that your 50mm primes that are generally quite cheap, they are actually become an 85, which isn't so useful, and finding a 35mm 1.4 can get very expensive. So having the crop is a bit of a pain, but generally I think people kind of overrate this. If you want to go on the wide end of things, then I think my 17 to 50 goes plenty wide enough, and then if that's not wide enough for you, then you can also get the Tokina 11 to 16, which is a great wide angle lens. And of course, if you're going on the other end of the scale, the telephoto lenses are great because they just are 1.6 times more powerful. But the real drawback of a small sensor is the low light performance. So for instance, obviously if you're shooting outside, then you're not going to have a problem, but when you're indoors, I tend to be at ISO 800 quite often. Now with the crop sensor camera, my T3i, the image does get pretty grainy at ISO 800. You can see right now I'm shooting at ISO 800, and me personally, I wouldn't want to go anywhere past that, and really I'd much rather shoot at 400 or 200. And with a camera like the 5D, for example, you can get very clean images at 800 and quite a lot past that. So the general idea with low light performance is that ideally you could shoot in a pretty dark room and get correct exposure without having a really grainy image. And while the T3i is far better than a lot of camcorders for the price, this is something where the 5D really shines. And the last thing about image quality that you'll probably hear many times is that DSLRs have a problem with aliasing and rolling shutter. Now, aliasing is something that's probably the bigger problem. It occurs when you're shooting with people with a stripy t-shirt or brick walls often, and really it's not a very desirable look, and it is a problem for DSLRs. But again, this is something that is quite easily outweighed by the rest of the features of the camera, and it's something that you can sort of avoid it, and if you can't avoid it, it doesn't happen that often, so it's really not much of a big deal. And rolling shutter is pretty similar. If you do whip pans or you shoot out of a fast moving car out the window, then you will see that everything is on a slant, and again, this is something that this is even more avoidable, and it's just something to bear in mind when you're shooting, that it does have rolling shutter, so you just have to keep the camera movement as smooth and slow as possible. The price that you'd have to pay to get a global shutter for a low budget camera like this, I think it's okay. Okay, so obviously there's plenty more to a camera than just the image quality, so now I'm just going to talk about the kind of build quality and the ergonomics of the camera. So first off, the main selling point of the 600D is the flip out screen. This is its one major advantage over the 550D, and yeah, to put it simply, it's a great feature. It means that the majority of the time you can leave the LCD where it is, but then if you do need to get a low or high shot, you don't have to be climbing up on top of things or getting down on the floor. You can just leave it where it is and tilt the screen so you can see what you're doing, which is a really great feature, and to be honest, I use it quite a lot. But generally, I would say that getting tack sharp focus with the LCD is quite tricky sometimes. Even using a viewfinder to magnify it, there are still times when you can't really tell until afterwards whether your footage was completely in focus. So that's something to bear in mind. Next up, the build quality generally. Now, with this being a kind of entry-level DSLR, the build quality is quite significantly worse than a 7D or a 5D. And this is kind of understandable. It is a cheaper camera, and to be honest, I think it's okay. Obviously the camera is strong enough that it's not going to fall apart, but it doesn't have that really rock solid feel. Sometimes if I have the camera loaded up with some heavy stuff, holding the grip, it does feel a little bit, it just feels quite plasticky. But really, is this a problem for a camera that's got such a great price point? I don't think so. Okay, so next up is the manual control. Now, in terms of the menus and the buttons and how they work, I think it's all pretty good. A lot of people say that the jump between video cameras and DSLRs is quite a big learning curve, and while that's true, it's not quite as intimidating as many people make it out to be. Once you've got the idea behind ISO, shutter speed and f-stop, you're pretty much good to go, and generally the camera's pretty easy to navigate through the menus, and it all works pretty well. Okay, so finally I just want to talk about the size. Now, because it's such a small camera and is obviously built for photography, hand holding it out in front of you while you're looking at the screen, you're not going to get steady images. Now, people often say that this is a downfall of a DSLR, but I don't think that needing to buy a rig is such a bad thing. Having a rig it means that no matter what camera you have down the line, you will always have a way of stabilizing it. My rig that I've got, I could mount an FS700 on it and it'd work pretty good, and it just means that if I was to buy a big camera and not have a rig, then later on down the line, if I bought a small camera, then I would have to buy a rig. Whereas if I just buy a small camera from the start, because that's the way things are going, everything's getting smaller, so it makes sense that you have a rig so that no matter when it is, you can always shoot with a smaller camera. Plus, rigs are very well built, and they're so adjustable that they'll work with any camera and will last a very long time. Okay, so in conclusion, I think this camera is really, really impressive. The amount it can do for for the low price that it has. You know, being one of the little siblings to the 5D, I think it performs really well in all aspects, pretty much other than low light. And you know, it still is a pretty good low light camera, but that's just the biggest difference between it and the 5D. Now there are other entry level DSLRs that you can go for. I decided to go for the T3i because, you know, it's a very well established camera that's known to be really good. You don't have to do any hacks on it to get it where it is, and it has the APS-C size sensor along with a very good range of lenses that are quite feature proof. The image quality is pretty good in 1080p. Obviously if you have a 4K native camera and you scale it down to 1080p, it will look better, but we're talking about, you know, relative to price, so I would say that it performs really well. And it's the same story for low light and dynamic range. You know, it does a pretty good job for the price. And then finally, the ergonomics. You know, I think it works really well as a video camera, and sure, you do have to buy a rig, but then that's something that you can keep for many years and use with any smaller camera, and since it's so adjustable, you know, it'll work really well. So this is a camera that is advertised as an entry-level camera, and it's a really good way of getting really high quality 1080p video with a shallow depth of field and a decent dynamic range. The ratio of price to how good it is, it really does go in the favour of the T3i.